Hi friends, welcome to another story time with the Chenango Landing Canal Boat Museum. I'm Miss Lindsay and today we are continuing with Minnie the Mule and the Erie Canal. Chapter 11, New Adventure. Now that the tug was pulling them, everyone relaxed. They were on the Hudson River and there would be no locks to go through. The river was lined with villages who sent bumboats out to visit the tugs. Why do they call them that, Pa? Sarah was watching a canopied, steam-powered boat that was attaching itself to a tow going down the river ahead of them. Because they bum a ride with whatever tow they hitch up to, and they stay with it until it passes a tow going the other way. Tomorrow, we may have one attach itself to our tow, and we will go aboard. Her father stretched his arms over his head. I am really looking forward to this trip. Last year, we went aboard a bumboat near Kingston, and they sold everything. Fresh ice cream and candy and all kinds of treats. Jack licked his lips, remembering all the good things he had tried. Are we going to eat pretty soon? I swear, you have a hollow leg, Jack Fairweather. Abby laughed. Yes, we will eat in just a little while. She waved to his mother where she sat in the bow of the Fairchild too, riding almost against their stern. Is it safe to go back and forth while we are being towed, John? Dan and I made that portable bridge a couple of years ago. Her husband pointed to a long, flat piece of wood, almost half the width of the cabin roof. We made hooks on both boats so we can fasten them on. It comes in handy when we want to go from one boat to another while we are being towed. I wondered what that was for. Sarah climbed up to the roof of the cabin, and Jack followed her. They sat with their knees bent and looked out at the green hills and tiny houses they could see in the distance. Tomorrow morning when we reach Kingston, we will probably be visited by a bumboat. Until then, we have to depend on our own kitchen. The captain grinned at his wife. Have you still got a few treats left? Enough for tonight without Mike to feed, she smiled. That man eats enough for two, and he never had a pleasant word. She drew a pad and a stubby pencil from her apron pocket. I have to make a list of things we need if we do get a chance to shop. The air smells different than it does on the canal, Sarah sniffed. I like it. We are getting into salt water now, so it smells like the ocean. Her father smiled. I would not try drinking it. It would make you sick. And it is not much good for washing clothes. Everything gets rough and crusty. We still have fresh water in the barrels, thank goodness. It is great for swimming, though. Remember last year? We swam when the tow stopped for an hour, Jack said. Do you think we might get a chance to swim tomorrow? I would not be surprised. These 2 days will go by quickly, so enjoy them. Captain Fairweather puffed contentedly on his pipe. He was right. The next day they reached Kingston just before noon, and as he had predicted, a steam-powered boat with a gaily striped awning fastened itself to the hooks that usually fastened the mule tow lines. Sarah and her parents and Jack's family eagerly clambered down onto its decks. The inside cabin was full of counters with high stools bolted to the floor in front of them. The shelves behind them were full of Canoler's needs. Sarah's mother filled her baskets with spices, coffee, flour, and sugar. There was fresh milk as well, and cookies that smelled so good that Sarah's mouth watered. And candy. Just as Jack remembered, there were tubs of fresh ice cream, too. 2 hours went by quickly. Pa and Uncle Dan and men from other barges who had come across the portable bridges sat at one end of the counter, enjoying their first cold beer of the trip. Abigail and Mabel joined Jack and Sarah, eating big bowls of ice cream, and they each chose treats to take back to the barge before the owners of the bumboat said it was time to move forward in the tow. By the time that they had stowed their purchases, they could see the city of Poughkeepsie along the shoreline, and Pa said that meant they were halfway to the harbor. It was time to do a little work. Sarah and Jack were sent to clean the bow stable, and it was late in the day before they finished changing the hay on the floor, cleaning the feed mangers, and shoveling waste overboard. The little closet where the slop pail was kept was scrubbed, and fresh sawdust put on the floor. The two of them stood, hands on hips, to survey their finished work. I smell like Minnie and the other two girls. Sarah looked at her dirty hands ruefully. Just before dusk, the tow stopped for an hour, and most of those who could swim changed into swimming gear. They jumped into the cold, clear water and had their first real bath since leaving home. Sarah and her family had washed in the cabin, but some canollers who traveled with only the owner and crew had probably not washed all over since they started their trip. Now they splashed and floated and soaked themselves liberally as they paddled around their barges. Sarah's mother and father were both good swimmers, and so was she and her cousin. Jack's father jumped in with them, but Aunt Mabel sat by the rail-land and watched. She preferred her tub in the kitchen galley. The nights were cold on the water, and no one stayed in too long, but the salt water was refreshing, and they all felt clean once more. We had better get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow we should dock in the harbor and get ready to unload our cargo. Sarah's father tousled her damp hair as she came out of her cuddy in her long nightgown. I will never forget this trip. I am so glad you let me come. She threw her arms around him and he hugged her tightly. She was fast asleep almost before she pulled her covers up. Chapter 12. The plot thickens. Sarah was up and ready for the day before the tow arrived at New York City's busy harbor. She had wakened to the sound of other boats near them, and the closer they came to the city, the busier the waters were. There were tugs pushing covered deck barges, moving packaged freight, and open deck barges handling bulk freight. She could see double-ended passenger ferry boats shuttling back and forth across the harbor, delivering people and their cargo to their destinations. Garbage scows were being towed out to sea where their refuse would be dumped beyond the city limits. Ocean-going freighters were anchored, waiting to be docked at the pier. Sarah watched, fascinated, as the small tugs pushed and pulled the big liners into position at the North River Pier. The tow stopped so Pa and Uncle Dan, with the help from the warehouse workers, could unload his lumber at the big Steinway piano factory near the Brooklyn Pier. And as other tugs were emptied of their cargo, they were towed to the piers on South Street at Manhattan Island. Pa said it might be 2 or 3 days before he arranged for a load to tow west to Syracuse, or maybe even to Buffalo. That meant that the family could do some sightseeing. Sarah and her mother and Aunt Mabel visited the busy Fulton Street Fish Market, and Sarah's eyes opened wide at the sights and smells. Push carts were selling all kinds of things. Mama promised they would buy fresh oysters or clams to take back for supper before they left. She let Sarah try some on the half shell, even though they cost a penny apiece. When they got hungry, Mama treated her and Aunt Mabel to a Coney Island Red Hot that looked like a long hot dog and tasted like one too. These are too costly, Abigail, Aunt Mabel protested weakly as she eagerly took the first bite of hers. Imagine a nickel for a hot dog. Abby laughed. Enjoy it. We might not get back here until next year. I wish Jack could have come with us. Sarah licked the mustard from her fingers, and her mother gave her a paper napkin to finish the job. It is time for him to start learning the business. He has gone with your Pa and Uncle Dan. Abigail raised her parasol to shield her eyes from the bright blue sun. Sarah thought she looked prettier than any of the other women shopping on the square. Her blonde hair was done in a high pompadour. Sarah had watched, fascinated, as she wrapped it around a big piece of rolled netting and fastened it with long hairpins. Usually, Mama pulled her long hair back into a knot at the nape of her neck. She preferred her parasol to the wide-brimmed hats so many of the women, including Aunt Mabel, wore. Her full-skirted dress was the same shade of blue as the one Sarah wore. When they finished eating, they walked the short distance to the New York City Aquarium in Battery Park. Mama and Aunt Mabel had been there before, but Sarah was enchanted. The aquarium was in a big circular red brick building, and she went from one glass tank to another, gazing at the saltwater fish in each. There were seahorses, dolphins, seals, octopi, swordfish, huge turtles, and so many others that she knew she would never remember all of their names. Time to leave, Sarah, if we are going to get back in time to prepare supper. Her mother smiled as she saw how reluctant she was to leave. We will still have a few days to enjoy. Maybe we will have time to come back. When they returned to their barge, Pa said there had been a change of plans. He had a broad grin on his face. We made a deal to haul some sea gravel to Smith's Roofing Company in Tonawanda, and we will be towed this morning over to Oyster Bay to the gravel beds. Does that mean we can't see any more things here? Sarah could not keep her disappointment from showing. No, it means we will go and get loaded and then be towed back here. We will be ready to go, but we will wait for the next tow going back up the Hudson. We will probably have another 2 or 3 days to see the sights. Sarah drew a deep breath of relief. Good, there are so many things to see. Jack grinned. Pa says you can show me all the things I missed today. I will. Sarah started to tell him about some of the fish she had seen in the aquarium, and her mother laughed. Let him see for himself when you go back. Right now, both of you need to get into bed. The next morning, a small steam tug hooked up to their barges and towed them up the East River, through the Hell Gate. A few hours later, they were pulled on the Long Island Sound to Oyster Bay. There, they moored at the gravel dock and were ready to load. It took 2 days to fully load their barges, and Sarah was kept busy helping her mother to ready their cabin for the return trip. They stripped their beds and put on clean linen. Dishes were washed and put back on clean shelves, and the black iron cook stove was polished until it shone once more. Abigail scrubbed the wooden kitchen floors on her knees. They kept a pad handy, and she and Sarah listed all the supplies they would need for the trip back along the canal. While Jack and Sarah went sightseeing, she and Aunt Mabel would go shopping. They arrived back at South Street before noon on the 3rd day, and Pa and Uncle Dan would go seek out a tow for the return trip. You two stay together and do not go any farther than the aquarium. Sarah's mother nervously tucked Sarah's stray curls back. Are you sure you know the way? Have you got the money Papa gave you? Sarah giggled. Yes, Mama. She held out the little purse that contained the coins Papa had given her. We will be careful, and we will be back to meet you before supper time. She was almost dancing with excitement. She couldn't wait to get started. Jack jingled his money in his town pants pockets. Pa loaned me his pocket watch so we can be sure to come back before you are ready to go back to the barge. Come on, Sarah. He took her hand and pulled her towards the Fulton Market. Whew! I thought sure they were going to make us stay with them, he grinned. Okay, cuz, lead on. What do we see first? Let's have a hot dog. We can eat it on our way over to the aquarium. And we can stop and see the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty on our way. Sarah gave an exuberant little skip as she kept up with Jack's long stride. They leaned together against a railing as they ate their hot dogs, dripping with mustard, and gazed out towards the harbor where they could see scows and barges being moved from one dock to another by little steam tugs that were much smaller than the boats they moved. Isn't that awesome? Sarah demanded. For once, Jack could not do anything but agree with her. And a little later, as they looked at the impressive structure of the nearby bridges, they had to stop until he absorbed their beauty. Before they turned to go, he said, "Someday I am going to learn how to build things like that." His face was solemn, and he had a determined look on his usually carefree face as he craned his neck to see some of the tall buildings around them. They entered the round red building that held the aquarium. It was cool and dim after the bright sun outside, and they paused in the open lobby to look around. Suddenly, Sarah grasped Jack's arm. "Look over there! Isn't that Mike?" She nodded towards the soaring, rounded tank where some of the larger fish were swimming. The tank was across the big room, and it took Jack a minute to follow her gaze. "You are right. But who's that he is talking to? And how did he get here?" Jack took a step in the direction, and Sarah pulled him back. "Don't let him see you." Sarah pulled on his sleeve until he backed around the corner where Mike could not see them. They both peered cautiously around the tank and watched as Mike stood deep in conversation with another man. They were dressed in black jackets and brown trousers tucked into scruffy boots. Mike's friend had a straggly red hair and straggly red beard, and they were so involved in what they were talking about that they paid no attention to anyone in the crowded lobby. "Criminy! That guy kind of looks like Mike, doesn't he?" Jack leaned out farther to get a good look. "Yes, he does. Maybe it is his brother." Sarah was puzzled. "What is Mike doing here, Jack? We left him way back in Watervliet." "I don't know." Jack pushed his hands through his dark, curly hair. "I wonder if this means he won't be going back with us when we get back to the canal." They watched the two men for another few minutes until they suddenly headed in their direction, going towards the doors to the street. Sarah drew Jack farther back where they would not be seen, and they watched until they went out the door. "What do you think of that?" Jack was puzzled. If he wanted to come to the city, why didn't he just ride with us? "I don't know what to think." "You know what?" Sarah's eyes widened in excitement. "That man matched the description of the bank robber. I bet Mike is working with him." "That's a crazy idea. Mike has been on the barge all the way down from Rome. How could he be mixed up in a bank robbery?" Maybe she felt a little foolish. "Well, let's look at the fish." For the rest of the afternoon, though, she kept remembering those men, and she could not shake the feeling that the red-headed man might be the bank robber. "I'm going to tell Papa about what we saw and see what he thinks." That is the end of our story for today. Thank you, friends. I hope you join us tomorrow for chapters 13 and 14 of Minnie the Mule and the Erie Canal. See you soon.